tonight on any issues that you're interested about. As you know, just a week ago, we tabled Alberta's budget for the upcoming year. It's a plan for healthcare and jobs to protect lives and livelihoods. I'm happy to answer questions about that, about the vaccine program, or anything else that's on your mind. Legislature is back in session, and we'll be introducing some interesting bills next week to keep commitments that we've made to Albertans. For example, we'll be introducing the Recall Act following public consultations that were led by a committee of the legislature last year, and as well a Citizens Initiative Act that will allow voters to prompt referendum votes on important issues that perhaps those of us up here in the legislature are not paying enough attention to. This past week, we also rolled out our very big, ambitious capital plan as part of the Alberta Economic Recovery Strategy, $20.7 billion over 3 years, creating 50,000 direct and 40,000 indirect jobs. Part of our strategy to build, to grow, and to diversify Alberta's economy. Today, details coming out about 16 new schools that are going ahead in this construction season. I just wanted to, before we go to questions, say that there's no shortage of reasons to be a bit down in the dumps in the end of COVID here, but I increasingly am optimistic about our future, and I truly mean that. The Bank of Montreal just projected this week that they believe Alberta will lead Canada in economic growth with 6.5% growth in our GDP, which would be phenomenal. A week ago, I announced a critical, game-changing investment in Alberta from the world's second largest information technology consulting company, Infosys. It's a Indian-based company with $76 billion in market capitalization. So it's a big deal, and they're starting out with 500 jobs in Calgary, planning to scale that up to 2,000. We were already off to an amazing start in venture capital to support innovation in the digital economy. We have a couple of exciting announcements on the horizon about that are game changers for things like the television and film industries. Real estate's been doing very, very well, which seems kind of counterintuitive, but 2020 was a strong year for housing starts, and real estate values are coming back stronger in many parts of the province. Ag prices are up, and yields were at almost record highs last year, so farm receipts are amongst their best in history. I know that doesn't include every farmer. There's been some pockets of bad weather, but overall a very positive story. Forestry is having its best year ever, another important historical industry. Oil prices, as you know, have recovered and are doing well, very well, with West Texas Intermediate bumping around $65 with a very tight differential with Western Canadian Select, which is the main price for our bitumen, and that's only about $11 differential. That means more capital spending is going to come back into the oil patch, which means more jobs all throughout the province. There's a lot more good stuff in the offing here. As I say, we're kind of in the end part of this COVID catastrophe with a race right now between variants and vaccines. We've vaccinated, as of last night, about 308,000 doses had been administered. About 212,000 Albertans had gotten at least their first dose. And the others had received their second dose, including everyone in long-term care, where 2/3 of our fatalities have been. And if we continue to, the feds have got to do their part and start getting us more doses, but if we start getting what they've promised to us, then, as our health minister said, we hope to be in a position to have inoculated every adult who wants to be vaccinated by Canada Day, by July the 1st. And that obviously will mean more freedom. But we're not out of it yet. That's enough kind of introductory comments for me. Let's go to your questions. Zach Nelson's got the first one. He says, my question for Premier, why didn't your government allow high-intensity workouts? Okay, thanks, Zach. I'm not aware of any place in Canada, or very few places in the Western world, that in COVID have permitted or are permitting high-intensity workouts. The main way that COVID is spread is through droplets being projected, that is to say little bits of saliva being projected into the air and other people ingesting that. And so the kinds of actions or activity most likely to spread COVID are high intensity activity where people get their heart rate up, where they tend to breathe heavier, respire more heavily, and project those projectiles more forcefully. And that would be like high intensity workouts. And the other is just being close to someone, typically within 6 feet for 15 minutes or more. Those two things are judged to be the most risky activities, and that's why we've had to continue to be cautious. I know everybody wants the COVID to be completely gone. The reality is, and I know some people don't want to hear it, but those variants are out there. They have been increasing somewhat, and they are way, way more contagious than the standard COVID-19. If you don't believe me, look at what happened to Israel, Britain, and Ireland. Even though Israel and Britain had the best vaccine programs in the world, they went into really hard lockdowns for most of the past 2-3 months because of the variant contagion, and they're only now starting to come out of that with much, much higher levels of vaccination than here in Canada. Next question goes to Linda Wiegand, who says, when do 65 to 75 get their vaccines? Well, we hope fairly soon, Linda. Right now, anybody over 75 can sign up for the the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccine. And First Nations Albertans over the age of 60 can do the same. They have, sadly, much worse health outcomes. But we've just started to open registration this morning for the AstraZeneca vaccine. It is not deemed yet to be fully effective for people 65 and over. So we're starting the registration on that for people who are 64, who are turning 64 this year, and then going down from there year by year. So unfortunately, you're right, there is that bubble. You know, we can only do AstraZeneca up to age 65, and then we haven't quite got down into the under 75 crowd, but we'll get to that quite soon. That's the next cohort to go. And I'm just told that, phase 2A registration, that's for the people who are 65 to 75, starts on March 15th, and that's based on year of birth. Okay, so Jerry Style, let me see, can't quite see that. He says, can we get a breakdown of where our taxes go? Yeah, so I assume you're talking here to me about provincial taxes. You can look this up. We'll ask my folks to put a link in the comments section to the provincial budget, and you can see where your tax dollars go. In Alberta, about 42% of your tax dollars go to healthcare, and over half of that is to wages, salaries, benefits, and things like physician compensation and the like. The next biggest item, which would be about 20% of the budget, is education. And about 80% of the education expenditures go to salaries, wages, and benefits, primarily for teachers, but also other staff. Overall, across the $56 billion budget of Alberta's government, about half of what we spend is compensation for public servants, teachers, doctors, nurses, and police, etc. So I think there's a pie chart in the budget which kind of breaks it down in a kind of a very basic way. And yeah, this is $27 billion of public sector compensation out of the $56 billion budget. And you can find the general line here on page 15 for expenses. And so a lot of information right there. All right, Crystal Tate says, you said in January that you would give guidance by the end of February with respect to large summer events. When will you provide that guidance? Thank you, Crystal. So there is a working group involving a lot of the major summer events organizers, like the Calgary Stampede, and they're working with the public health officials to develop parameters and guidelines. And I keep asking them to come forward with their initial recommendations. I hope to get that at our Cabinet COVID committee in the near future. Because I understand that for large summer events, those folks do need a good advance notice. You can't just turn around on a dime and organize events, big events. Now, I guess my current state of thought, based on everything I see and hear, is that if we are able to maintain the current pace of inoculation and do get the supplies that the feds have promised us, that we should be in a totally different situation by the end of June. And we should be able to proceed with a higher risk tolerance, because the majority of adults by that time should have received at least their first dose. Plus, summer weather helps with the seasonality of a contagious respiratory virus of this nature. So I'm optimistic that we're going to have summer events. However, I would not be surprised if there are some limitations on crowd sizes, on proximity, on things like that. I still have a hard time getting around in my mind how we could have like 25, 30,000 people sitting cheek to jowl next to each other in the stands at the Stampede. So, Crystal, let's just wait and get the advice of that working group between the major event organizers and the public health folks at the Alberta government. Mr. Vic Chandra says, when will theaters be open? Well, the next phase of the path forward is we're going to see where we're at on March the 22nd. If my folks here have the path forward, I'd like to see that. But I do believe there may be limited opening of theaters scheduled potentially for phase 3. We're below the key hospitalization threshold to qualify for that, which is under 300. Right now we're at about 250 in hospital, but we'll need to keep an eye on the direction of all of those key metrics, including the rate of transmission and so forth. But I believe, actually, I'm told here, yeah, correct, it is at a step 3, so it would not be any earlier than March 22nd. Let me put it that way. All right, so next question goes to Jody Lynn Michelle Barrett. 16 states have stopped restrictions and mandates opened up. Why haven't we? There is no way our numbers are worse than theirs, e.g. Texas. Actually, Jody, part of the answer is that the U.S. is massively ahead of us on vaccinations, and they have different weather, and they have more healthcare capacity. The U.S., as you know, has largely a private healthcare system, which is almost twice as large as ours. I mean, they spend about 16% of their economy on healthcare versus about 8% in Canada. So they have way more nurses, doctors, hospitals, and hospital beds, for starters. Secondly, they have much warmer weather in Texas. They got past their crazy their winter blizzard last month, and now they're into what we would almost regard as summer weather, which is much better for a respiratory virus of this nature. But most importantly, they're now pushing, I think, 15 to 20% of their population having been inoculated versus only 3.4% in Canada. And that's because our federal government did a very poor job of procuring the vaccine doses. So the U.S. is much closer to inoculating the vulnerable elderly population in particular than we are here. And so those states are able to proceed more quickly with reopening. So as I always say, vaccines equal freedom. That's why we need more vaccine doses. That's why we continue to implore the federal government to get on top of that and do their job. All right, D. Janko says, why did you let Trudeau do quarantine hotels when you had an effective pilot program at airports crushing travel and airline industry? Thank you, D. I was very proud of the work that our government did to bring in the travel pilot. But to be clear, it only happened because we had permission from the Government of Canada, or cooperation from the Government of Canada. The federal government obviously controls the borders, the international borders and international travelers arriving in Canada. That is their exclusive power under the Constitution. And so they decide who can come into the country and under what conditions, including during a pandemic, quarantine conditions. We went to them way back last summer and said, look, we want to be leaders in promoting safe travel, partly to save the airline industry, the tourism industry, et cetera. So we pitched the feds on the travel pilot It took them months to finally agree to it. But the key agreement they gave us was to shorten the federal quarantine requirement for arriving international travelers from 14 days effectively to 2 days until people got a negative result back from their first test at the airport. And that, you're quite right, that was working very good. It was, we were able to get people out of quarantine a lot, or self-isolation a lot faster. But we also had the safety of capturing samples from all arriving international travelers. We were able to put those samples through screening for the variant cases and genome sequencing to get a better sense of what kind of threat was coming into the country. And on the second test, sometimes we were able to identify that people had become sick. And so it was very useful. We did over 40,000 participants in the Alberta testing pilot. But the feds decided in December that they were just going to, or was it earlier this year, January, they were just going to step in and take it, and they just killed our program. Our program depended on them giving us permission to offer a curtailed quarantine period. They took that permission away. We fought them on it, but ultimately they write the rules for the conditions on which people enter the country. So I regret it. I'm glad that we had the Alberta pilot, and I hope we can get back to it as soon as possible. And we continue to demand that from the Government of Canada. All right, Lucy Lovelock says, will you stick to step 3 and 4 when we get to them and open up as the pathway forward suggests? Our kids' mental health is not okay, and they need things to look forward to. I agree, Lucy, and I certainly hope that we can. But you'll understand that if we have steps 3 and 4 are based, the primary criteria is hospitalizations. Step 4 would require under 150 Albertans in hospital with COVID. Right now we're at 250, and that number seems to be pretty constant, holding flat, more or less. So right now we're not in the zone for the step 4 path forward relaxations. But we also have to keep an eye on what we call the leading indicators. And if, for example, and you'll understand this, Lucy, if we suddenly see a sustained worrisome spike in new cases, in the rate of transmission, in hospitalizations, and the number of active cases, we're going to have to take a look at that because the last thing we want is to open a lot more stuff up and then see hospital beds piling up again with COVID patients and then have to tap the brakes. We want to get off the roller coaster. And certainly the vaccines will help us to do that. So I sure as heck hope we can proceed as planned based on hospitalizations with the next 2 steps. But one thing we know about this COVID year is uncertainty. Now let me add that in terms of children's mental health, we will be creating a special task force on youth and children's mental health in the COVID era, led by Calgary Southeast MLA Matt Jones. He's proposed this. He's been very focused on the negative mental health impact for children that you've referred to, Lucy. And so we'll have more to say about that. We have added additional resources and support for youth mental health, including money for the Kids Helpline, for example. And I think one of the most important things we could do for youth mental health was reopening the schools, as we've had them open, as you know, since August, with the exception of a 1-week extended Christmas holiday. And I just want you to remember that the unions and the opposition party and a lot of special interests were caterwauling. They didn't want us to reopen the schools. There were, in fact, our education minister, LaGrange, got death threats for having done so. We were right, though, to reopen the schools, partly for the mental health of kids, and it has been safe. In fact, I was reviewing some data earlier today, and I can say that 89% of Alberta schools have had no COVID cases since reopening in August, September. And of the 700,000 students in our K-12 school system, 99.94% of them have not suffered from in-school transmission of the virus. Only 0.06% did. So I'm looking forward to the people who tried to create hysteria and panic amongst parents. Because we reopened the schools, I'm looking forward to them apologizing for having done so. All right, Spencer B says, how do you respond to the NDP's claim that the vaccine rollout has been embarrassing? Well, they make all sorts of claims, and they're always, unfortunately, it seems like trying to create fear and panic in this pandemic rather than calm confidence. In fact, Alberta has been one of the best performing provinces in the country on the vaccines. We were the first to fully inoculate residents of long-term care facilities with double doses. We've been ahead of the other large population provinces most of the time on the pace of our inoculation. Quebec took a slightly different approach because they decided to go to a 3-month interval between first and second doses fairly early on. So they've got first doses out to more people, but we're well ahead of, for example, Ontario. And I think we're doing well. We opened up today to what we call Group 2D, which is the people under 65 who can access the AstraZeneca vaccine. And I understand that process went well. We did have one blip a couple of weeks back when we opened up registration for people over 75 and over for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines because we got, I think, 1.2 million phone calls in the space of a couple of hours. And the system kind of crashed for a few hours, but they got it back online. They should have stress tested for a larger volume of calls and online registration. But I think any reasonable person can understand when you get hammered with 1.2 million calls, it's a pretty unique level of pressure. But apart from that one half-day blip, I think we've done extremely well, and credit goes to the people on the front lines delivering those vaccines. Rick Kozak says, where's the Supreme Court on the carbon tax? Well, they heard oral arguments on, first of all, I'll back up and say, as you know, Alberta won by a vote of 4-1 the carbon tax reference at the Appeal Court of Alberta back in just over a year ago, February of 2020, in which that court referred to the federal carbon tax as a, quote, constitutional Trojan horse. And so that is under appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada, together with the reference decisions of the Saskatchewan and Ontario Courts of Appeal. Oral arguments were heard on those appeals last September. All three cases are kind of bundled together, and we are expecting a judgment perhaps later this month. That's what I'm told to expect. Evan Scheichel, I'm sorry if I misread that, says, what happened to you fighting against Trudeau and fighting against equalization payments? Well, Evan, I just mentioned that we are fighting Trudeau on the carbon tax. We repealed the NDP carbon tax here in Alberta as our first act of government. We then sued the federal government, getting a declaration that their federal carbon tax is unconstitutional. That's now under appeal. Just 2 weeks ago, we were at the Alberta Appeal Court suing Prime Minister Trudeau and his government over the unconstitutionality of their No More Pipelines Law, Bill C-69. We are indirectly, if you will, suing the Trudeau government for their Bill C-48 tanker ban on the West Coast. We're doing that by supporting pro-development First Nations. We will be holding the referendum on equalization this fall. But just to be clear, the Alberta government does not send any money to Ottawa. So we can't turn off any flow of money or taps of tax dollars to Ottawa. They get the equalization from the federal taxes that you pay through GST, federal income, and business taxes. So we will be challenging the principle of that in the Constitution to push up the agenda, our fight for fiscal fairness. We have created our own Alberta Provincial Parole Board. We're in the process of finalizing the creation of an Alberta Chief Firearms Officer to administer firearms laws in a common sense Alberta way. We are doing a deep technical study on the costs, benefits, and potential structure of an Alberta Provincial Police Force and an Alberta pension plan. We've renewed the Alberta Senate Election Act, and we'll be holding elections for our nominees for vacant positions in the Senate of Canada later this year. We're about to launch our legislature committee to work on the entrenchment of property rights in the Canadian Constitution. We've also won some important victories with the federal government. For example, we managed to get what's called an equivalency agreement for the major emitters levy that saved Alberta businesses billions of dollars. We also got an equivalency agreement on methane regulations. So Alberta gets to design and implement those regs rather than the feds. According to the oil and gas industry, that too will save them billions of dollars. We managed to get an agreement with the feds to allow Alberta to design and implement a species at risk plan for woodland caribou under the Species at Risk Act, Chapter 11. Now that may sound very technical, but for people living in northern Alberta, it is a huge issue. If the feds took over on that one, it could cause billions of dollars of costs and thousands of jobs. Again, critical there. We managed to get $1 billion out of the feds to support the well site reclamation program, which is creating thousands of oil field service jobs. We did get something out of them from our demands for fairness through the fiscal stabilization program, but only really about 10% of what we believe that we are entitled to as a province, and we're going to keep pushing and fighting like heck on that. And there's a whole bunch of other issues where we continue to really be unfortunately in a confrontational position, but we won't stop fighting for our jobs in the economy here. One example that you're going to hear more about in the near future is their ridiculous ban on plastics, where they want in regulation to refer to all plastics as toxins like lead or mercury. That would jeopardize the future of our petrochemical and chemical industries. So many other irons in the fire, but we've not given up. In fact, we're redoubling our efforts on all of those and other issues. All right, Brian Johnston says, when's the vote on canceling time change in the spring and fall, and will this government listen to voters instead of industry like the NDP did? So, great question. We have not made a final decision, but we may be holding a referendum on that at the same time as the municipal election, where Albertans will get their final say. Okay, next question goes to, what we got here? Sorry, folks, 1 second. Seem to have a tech, like our computer froze there for a moment. Abanto Panel Rodell says, when will the church be increased from 15% to a high number? So, yes, thank you, Abanto. The answer is that Phase 3 of the path forward contemplates a possible increase in the capacity limits for places of worship. I know that the 15% limit has been a real inconvenience and in some cases a real sacrifice for faith communities. I go to church and sometimes I haven't been able to go into my church because they reached maximum capacity, or all of the available seats got booked up in advance. And one of my greatest regrets in all of this has been this impairment on congregational worship for the exercise of freedom of religion. But we do know that congregational worship has been a relatively high-risk setting for COVID spread. We had a number of outbreaks last year, some of which proved to be deadly, in places of worship that were not properly following the COVID guidelines. And that's one of the reasons we have to be careful. But we are hoping that if the numbers stay stable, we'll be able to increase congregational worship capacity limits in Phase 3, which could be as early as March 22nd. Gwen Hampton says, I'd love to see a program to help our post-secondary graduates connect with employers. As would I. And in fact, we do have a lot of programs like that. You know, Gwen, one of the things I'm passionate about is our Skills for Jobs agenda, to copy some aspects of the German training system, where effectively high school kids are sponsored for paid apprenticeships with companies in over 350 apprenticeable trades. They usually do 3 days, 4 days with their employer, and then 1 to 2 days in the classroom, getting kind of complementary theory. And they kind of graduate from secondary school and get an apprenticeship certificate, a trade certificate, which usually In over 90% of cases, the employer they were working with in the apprenticeship hires them on permanently after that. That is an ideal system that bridges the gap between secondary, post-secondary education, job training, and employment. So we're expanding programs like Careers the Next Generation and the Alberta, I forget the exact name of it, but the apprenticeship program in the high schools to create more opportunities like that. We're also expanding support for co-op programs to do just that. And in the next little while, we're going to be announcing the Jobs Now program, which has a big emphasis on what I call employer-led job training. So employers have some skin in the game, and they are putting some money in with the government to hire new people for jobs that are available. So it's a good question, and we're certainly moving in that direction. All right, Diane, Lionel, I suppose it's Diane and or Lionel Moreau, say, do we have a choice on the vaccine that we get? Yes, there is a choice, and obviously the pace of all this depends on your age and health condition. Older Albertans, people with multiple chronic conditions are prioritized in the rollout. But at the end of the day, if you're kind of just in the general population, I'm 51, 52, I guess, and when my time comes up, I'm fully expecting that I will be able to choose between Moderna, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, possibly Johnson & Johnson, and who knows, possibly another one. Now, I do know that some people do have ethical concerns about, for example, the AstraZeneca and other vaccines that are created from fetal stem cell lines. And I do know that that is not an issue with Moderna and Pfizer because they are basically synthetic forms of vaccines. They are, and there is not that ethical issue for many people. So I've been clear with our health officials here that people must have a choice, partly to reflect their conscientious concerns that they may have on those ethical issues, but also they may have be like really well read in the science of the competing vaccines, and they may choose one over another for reasons of tested efficacy or other factors. So we want people to have that choice. And certainly people will have a choice about whether they get vaccinated or not, pardon me. In fact, we will be bringing forward in a couple of weeks fairly wide-ranging amendments to Alberta's Public Health Act, in part to delete the power of mandatory inoculation that has been in that law since 1910. All right, Ivan, MH, says, not a COVID question, good, thank you. But I'd like to know, where are we with Provincial Parole Board to deal with repeat offenders issue? Yeah, Ivan, we've just created the Provincial Parole Board. The legislation was passed last year. We have appointed the first chair of the board. It's former Calgary Police Service Chief Rick Hansen. So they should be up and running fairly soon here. And we do hope that they bring much more of an Alberta common sense focus to questions around parole and supervised release, etc. But one little caveat or note here is that they will only be able to deal with provincial offenders. And it's a relatively small share of the overall population of prisoners. So provincial offenses are those typically that carry a potential custodial sentence, a penal sentence of 2 years or less. So the more serious offenders that you're probably thinking about, Ivan, pardon me, we've been reading some of these outrageous cases here in Alberta of convicted repeat sex offenders, including pedophiles, going through the revolving door, being released time after again. Those would be more serious criminal indictable offenses as opposed to summary offenses. They would go into the federal parole board system, not the provincial one. We cannot control those. But I think it's outrageous that Justin Trudeau's government repealed most of the mandatory minimum prison sentences that the Harper government brought in for offenses like sexual offenses against children. As far as I'm concerned, if you repeatedly engage in the sexual exploitation of a minor, we should lock the door and throw away the proverbial key. And if you're doing that repeatedly, I don't understand how these people are allowed out of jail at all. So I share your concern, Ivan, and I'm just frankly disgusted that we've gone back to the revolving door system for child sex offenders. Stephen G says, are we going to 24/7 vaccinations once we receive more vaccines? What's the plan once we hit a glut? Good question, Stephen. Right now, we like last week we were doing 10,000 a week, but we're running out of supply constantly, and clearly you understand that. So if we finally start to get like a big dump of doses, we are ready to roll. And our aspirational target, our stretch goal, is 500,000 a week. If you take what we're already doing through AHS, add on to it about 300,000 a week that the pharmacies can deliver in principle. Add on to that these vaccine centers, these big like vaccine depots we're going to be setting up, and add on to that inoculation done by local GPs, family physicians. We believe we can do 400,000 to 500,000 a week. Now, we haven't been tested at that level yet, and obviously, if you're going that fast, there's going to be undoubtedly some things won't go perfect. There will be some gaps and some challenges with the logistics of doing several 100,000 a week. But I've been attending briefings and meetings almost on a daily basis for the past 2 months on exactly this question, and we are pretty confident that we can maintain a pace of several 100,000 a week once we get the doses. All right, Debbie Merchant Reynolds, I think we've heard from you on these things before, Debbie, if I'm not mistaken, says, you promised recall legislation. When can we get confirmation it's being put into effect? Confirmation right now, as I said off the top of the show, Debbie, it will be introduced early next week. We promised in our platform to have a legislature committee consult Albertans on the design of the recall law, to look at the BC recall statute from 1991 or 1990 as a kind of a reference point. And so the Ledge Committee on Democratic Reform held hearings last fall. They gave us the report, I think, just before Christmas. And we've taken that report and drafted the bill. It will be introduced early next week. And I also want to give a shout out to Drayton Valley MLA Mark Smith, who actually introduced a recall bill in the legislature as a private member's bill, his own bill, I think last year, I believe it was in the spring. And the government bill that will be tabled early next week will be very similar to the private member's bill that MLA Mark Smith had brought forward. Please hold with me 1 second, folks. All right. Pardon me if I seem a bit sluggish. I already been answering questions all day. It seems I did, of course, question period in the legislature, and then 2 hours of questioning at legislature committee on what we call estimates, and back at it here. Plus, a lot of other stuff today. It's been a busy day. Travis McCurdy says, "Why are health experts saying life won't go back to normal, even when herd immunity is reached?" I guess you'd have to ask those experts, Travis. I think some of them are saying that we don't yet fully know to what extent the vaccines inhibit infectiousness. What we do know is they dramatically reduce symptoms and sickness, which is the most important thing. But I would say this, there does appear to be growing real-world experience from Israel and the UK with the best inoculation programs in the world that these vaccines also reduce infectiousness. So I'm optimistic that those that we'll get it. I think those people who are being super cautious will hopefully be able to change their views as we see more and more real-world experience with the vaccines. I suspect in the long run, all of us are going to remember. We're going to have a muscle memory of just some good common sense hygiene practices about frequent hand washing and how we blow our nose or cough or sneeze. And I wouldn't be surprised to see people wearing masks in airplanes voluntarily in the future. So I think a lot of people are going to adopt different practices voluntarily. But Here's my point to the people who are saying things like we should never get back to normal post-vaccination, post-immunity. That what you're really saying is that the vaccines don't work, and that's a bad message to send. We want to encourage people to get inoculated with these safe vaccines. That's the key to freedom. Okay, John Timms says, "Hi, Premier. You touched on it a bit, but can you speak to some of the information technology job creation work Minister Schweitzer and his ministry are working on under that portfolio?" Thank you very much, John. That is so exciting. So last year, we have this Alberta Recovery Plan, which is our overarching strategy for economic recovery past the pandemic crisis and the global recession. And within the plan, there's a bunch of sector strategies. I would ask our team to please post a link to a couple of things. First of all, the Alberta Recovery Plan below, and specifically the technology and innovation sector strategy. Part of that sector strategy has been helping to prime the pump for venture capital. There's two main problems that our tech industry has had. One is access to capital, venture capital in particular, and that's really starting to change. So we put an extra $175 million tax dollars into a Crown corporation called the Alberta Enterprise Corporation. That is a kind of fund of funds. It invests primarily in venture capital funds that are investing primarily in startups, tech startups here in Alberta. That may have helped with what became a banner year, record year for venture capital in the province. Folks, that venture capital, it's kind of higher risk, smaller investments that are made in typically in information technology, digital startups. Last year, $600 million was raised through VenCap here in Alberta, which was a record. And I'm told, I believe that our January and February have already broken that record. So that seems to be going in the right direction. We also brought in the Innovation Employment Grant because all other provinces in most U.S. states have some form of fiscal incentive for tech startups. And the reason is, like, our philosophy as a government is to have the best overall kind of industry neutral policies that incent new job creating investment. That's why we reduced the overall business tax rate by a third from 12 to 8 points in what we call the job creation tax cut. However, most of these tech startups don't pay taxes for their first few years because their development costs are very steep and they generally don't have an early revenue stream. They don't have a product to put on the shelf in their first 1 to 5 years. And so they don't benefit from the lower business taxes. But to attract them, most jurisdictions have these incentives. So we've created a very strong one. It's called the Innovation Employment Grant, and it provides a grant of up to 20% for eligible costs related to research and development. You add onto that the federal SR&ED credit, and basically what you end up with is Alberta, we believe, having some of the strongest incentives in Canada. So those things are helping. But the other part is certainly on the labor side, the skilled labor, because there's a shortage of people with technical training in a lot of the IT and innovation space, like coding and so forth. And so that's why we have the Skills for Jobs agenda. The Jobs Now training program as well will be partnering with those companies who will have some money some skin in the game. They'll put some money in to help train people to the relevant skills. And then we're really starting to hit our stride. As I mentioned off the top, Infosys announcing 500 immediate jobs in Calgary, likely going to 2,000. We had, there's a whole number of companies that have announced anywhere between 200 and 400 new jobs being created right now this quarter in the tech sector. I just got off the phone on the weekend with the president of one of the largest IT companies in the world, who was talking to us about making Alberta a center for excellence in Canada for information and for digital training for these kinds of jobs. And I was very excited that he's talking to us about doing that in some of our mid-sized cities. We don't want this activity just going to Calgary and Edmonton. It's got to get out to mid-sized cities and rural communities with interconnectivity. We're working on an exciting plan right now to to really massively expand high-speed internet infrastructure so that rural Alberta can participate fully in the digital economy. Anyway, those are some of the points. Doug Schweitzer's a lot more articulate about this, and we should get him on one of these Facebook sessions. Travis McCurdy, I had a different McCurdy. Maybe it's the same fellow, I'm not sure. Will the YYC pilot program return? Canada's aviation sector depends on it. I hope so, Travis, but it's going to be up to the feds. And all I can say, I totally agree. We need to. I have been raising the alarm about the aviation sector, but and particularly WestJet, because it's so essential for Alberta's economic future. I've been raising this since last April, repeatedly with the Prime Minister and my fellow premiers, pleading with them not to layer on travel restriction after travel restriction. We do need to have safe travel. And I do think that testing upon arrival and some limited self-isolation requirement is totally necessary. And we had that in the pilot program, which is why it's so sad that it was pulled out away from us by the feds. We're going to continue to fight to bring it back. Randy McMullen says, what's happening with Line 5? Thank you, Randy. So context is that Line 5 is a 60-year-old pipeline that takes about 640,000 barrels of primarily Alberta, but also Saskatchewan and North Dakota crude across the Straits of Mackinac, which I believe is between Lakes Erie and Superior, and it takes it over to Sarnia, Ontario through Michigan. And the Democrat Attorney General and Governor of Michigan are trying to decommission the line because they say it's a threat to the lake, even though it's operated safely for 60 years. And even though Enbridge is willing to spend several $100 million to replace it with a subterranean pipe that would be a high-tech modern pipe that would have almost zero risk of lake spillage. But the governor and the AG are saying, well, it's going to take you 3 years to do that. We're not going to give you 3 years. Well, Enbridge says we can't just conjure a new pipeline out of nowhere. It takes time to do the engineering and construction safely. Give us the 3 years to build it. So the governor is taking what I quite frankly think is a embarrassingly ridiculous position to shut down her state's single largest source of energy. They wouldn't be able to fuel the home heating that depends on oil and propane in the northern Michigan Peninsula. Airplanes wouldn't be able to take off out of the Detroit airport. The refineries in northern Ohio that I visited on this issue 2019 would lose their feedstock. Thousands of jobs depend on it. And Sarnia refineries in southern Ontario, half of the oil consumed in Ontario and Quebec comes off of Line 5 originally. Some of it then gets shipped up to Montreal through Line 5 following the Enbridge reversal of that a few years ago. So this is critically important. We've got the Ontario and the Quebec governments totally on side, the Ohio government, other Midwestern U.S. governments on side. The federal government say they completely support us on this, but what concerned me about President Biden's unilateral and retroactive vetoing of the Keystone XL pipeline was it's created a precedent where some of these folks on the green left that are trying to landlock our energy could ask that he use the same authority to decommission Line 5. Now, where it's going at, I guess was the bottom line question was, where is it at? The executive order of the governor, which to decommission, which is supposed to come into effect in May, is being challenged by Enbridge in court, and we're doing everything we can politically to support them on that. So we'll have to wait for the decision of the court. But there is a treaty that dates from 1977 on existing pipeline infrastructure that passes between countries. I'm getting briefed on that this week, and we believe that that the governor's effort is a clear violation of that treaty. So we think we have a very strong legal case. All right, Al Hendricks says, highways are crumbling. Is there money for that? Yeah, well, Al, there's a lot of money for that. In fact, our government has doubled the Alberta budget for capital maintenance and repair. In our last year, we did that as part of our economic recovery plan. We're continuing. We've gone from $1 to $2 billion a year on capital maintenance and repair. The 2021 capital plan, a key part of our recovery strategy, invests $1.5 billion over 3 years to maintain our extensive existing road and bridge infrastructure. In addition, there's $2.5 billion over the next 3 years for key projects that expand and enhance our road network, like doubling or twinning Highway 3 between Burdett and Tabor, twinning Highway 40 coming out west of Grand Prairie, twinning the David Thompson Highway between roughly Sylvan Lake and Rocky Mountain House. What else have I got here? The plan also provides increased funding of $300 million from last year for capital maintenance and repair to maintain existing road and bridge infrastructure, and $51 million for P3 Ring Road rehabilitation. It also includes $135 million over the next 3 years towards planning, design, and construction of the new Lacrete Bridge, which is going to be a pay bridge up north. So yes, these are record levels of investments in highway maintenance and expansion. But there's never enough money to go around and address every single pothole and problem with every single highway, and especially at a time of fiscal crisis like we have right now. Edwin Newman says, I'll bet that the questions that he answers are scripted questions. Well, if they are, then I guess we just scripted that one, Edwin. I hope you're doing well. Please take care of yourself, my friend. Monica Hutnik says, when are these mask mandates going to end? Well, the honest answer, Monica, is I don't know. Mask wearing has now been, I know there's a lot of people that don't like it, but the truth is that there's now reams of studies from around the world that prove that wearing a effective face covering can significantly reduce the chances of transmission. I know some people out there say, yeah, but it doesn't stop aerosol projection. That's not the point. COVID is not generally translated by aerosols, those little microscopic kind of molecules. It is transmitted by droplets, much larger bits of saliva. Like I'm speaking right now, it's not visible, but I'm projecting droplets. If I was wearing a face covering, I got my handy mask right here, that would significantly inhibit them. And if you've got two people and they're both wearing it, there was a fascinating study done of about a couple of hairdressers. I think it was in Illinois. And they were both, it turns out, COVID positive. But they were wearing masks and their customers were wearing masks. They had 70 customers, none of whom got COVID positive. I mean, that's just one of dozens and dozens and dozens of studies out there. And here's the point. It doesn't cost us anything economically. Sure, it's a hassle, and some people really don't like it. But there's no economic cost. But it's an effective intervention. I'd rather rely on something like that, widespread mask use, than like shutting down a bunch of businesses or further impairing social freedoms and activities. So now, having said that, let's hope, knock on wood here, we get those doses the feds have promised us, and we get the adult population vaccinated, first dose at least by Canada Day. And here's hoping that the vaccines beat the variants in this race and that we don't get some huge late spring wave and we get good weather. Yeah, I absolutely hope that we can see a relaxation on those mask mandates this spring or summer. That's certainly my hope. All right, Joanne Peterson says, can an employer make the vaccine a condition of employment? No. Well, I'll take that back. There's no law against that. And an employer, I guess, can make that a condition of employment. We're not doing that as the government, not even Alberta Health Services. I mean, obviously, we strongly encourage and expect that our nurses and doctors will get vaccinated, but we're not going to fire them if they don't. We're not going to sanction them if they don't. And obviously, in some cases, there might be health reasons, maybe in other cases, ethical reasons or other concerns. that's the government's not going to use any authority to compel people. Now, private sector employer, I would encourage them not to do that. I think it can be counterproductive. I think it just creates more tension, and just let's educate people, encourage maximum take-up of the vaccines. We'll be removing the 1910, 110-year-old power of mandatory inoculation from the Public Health Act. And we will not be, as a government, issuing vaccine passports or documentation like that, because I think it would be a potential violation of the Privacy Act. All right, Will Osmond says, what is going to happen with Keystone XL pipeline? What is Alberta doing to push the project forward, given Biden's decision to reject the project? Yeah, thank you, Will. So we continue to work on it. I was on the phone with the chairman of the U.S. Senate Energy Committee, West Virginia Democrat Senator Manchin, about 2 weeks ago. He is probably the most powerful guy in the American Senate because he is the swing vote, and he is a strong supporter of this. We've also been communicating with Senator Tester from Montana, another Democrat. Our representative in Washington, James Rajat, has spoken to over 65 members of the Congress and Senate. We continue to communicate with governors, with major union leaders who support it, and obviously just continue to try to keep up the political pressure. The U.S. Senate did pass an amendment to a budget bill 3 weeks ago, requiring that the president reissue the permit for the KXL border crossing. But unfortunately, I think they got 52 votes on that, but unfortunately they need 66 votes for it to be veto-proof, and they just don't have that number of votes. So, we might be reaching the end of the line politically, and then we have to turn to our legal remedies, our legal alternatives, and we're working with TC Energy on that. But Chapter 11 of the North American Free Trade Agreement, a chapter that was carried over in a kind of grandfather clause under the new trade agreement, allows us, in principle, to sue the U.S. administration for damages for violating the investor protection provisions of NAFTA. And so we fully intend to defend our interest through the court, through the legal system. Tracy Shaban says, where do you stand on the mining in our Rockies, please? So Tracy, where I stand is in favor of environmentally responsible mining. We have had mines operating nonstop on the eastern slopes and the western slopes of the Canadian Rockies since at least the 1880s, probably the 1870s, before that. And I mean, ever since the first settlers showed up, they were mining on the eastern slopes. And we have, I believe, something like 7 coal mines on the eastern slopes right now. When I say the eastern slopes, some of them are up in the mountains, others are in the foothills on the eastern side, and they've operated safely without significant negative environmental impacts, in some cases for decades. But obviously, we have to maintain the most rigorous possible environmental standards to ensure that that continues to be the case. I can't imagine anybody in Alberta would want us to jeopardize sensitive ecosystems, the headwaters of the rivers that come off the eastern slopes. We have to be careful about issues like selenium that can be, if you have too much coal mining in a particular area, it can lead to concentrated amounts of selenium in the water table, for example. So those are all of the very serious environmental issues that regulators must assess when mining companies make applications. It's usually a multi-year process. There's a joint review panel between Canada and Alberta that is right now at the end stages of a 4 or 5 year long environmental assessment of the impacts of potentially reopening a coal mine down in the Crow's Nest Pass area, a mine that is strongly supported by the local community for economic reasons, but also by the Piikani First Nation. So I don't think it would be right to say to them that even though a mine safely operated there before, and let's say they meet all of the stringent criteria and the local community supports it, I don't think it would be right to then say, nope, it's all over. We're not going to let you pursue responsible resource development. It just has to, in our view, has to happen in a balanced way that ensures environmental protection, but does not exclude the possibility of job creation. You know, in British Columbia, I think they have, I forget the exact number, I want to say 12 coal mines in that province. And I just read a report that spending on prospecting for coal mines in British Columbia on the other side of the Rockies is up by like 20% this year. So other provinces are going to continue with, and that's under an NDP government, which until recently depended on support from the Green Party. So I think it's possible for us to walk and chew gum at the same time. We've always done that as a province, balancing responsible resource development with environmental protection. And there are, by the way, there are consultations on that. And I would invite my team to put in the comments section below a link to the public consultations on the future of coal mining. All right, and by the one last point on coal mining, because some people are opposed to coal mining because of CO2 emissions, but that primarily relates to thermal coal for coal-fired power plants. Most of the coal mining that happens on in the Rockies is for metallurgical coal, which is steel-making coal. And as Bill Gates says, you cannot run an industrial economy without that kind of high-intensity power. All right. 1 second, please. Cheryl Singleton says, why do you think you have the right to pull us out of the CPP? Should this not be the decision of the people of Alberta? Yes, Cheryl, I agree. It should be a decision of the people of Alberta. And that's why we've committed that if we do come forward with a recommendation to create our own Alberta pension plan, that it would be put before Albertans in a fair referendum vote. And why are we looking at that? Well, the Fair Deal panel consulted with Albertans and recommended that we pursue it. Quebec has had a very effective, successful Quebec provincial pension plan instead of the CPP since the 1960s. It's worked very well for them. Most Albertans are very frustrated with the huge fiscal transfers we make out of this province to Ottawa and the rest of the country. Represents typically about $20 billion a year, and $3 billion of that is through CPP premiums. Because we have the youngest population with the largest labor force, we have the highest percentage of our population that works, therefore the highest percentage that pays CPP premiums, and the youngest population not receiving CPP benefits, which means that we are huge net contributors to the CPP, basically meaning that younger Alberta workers are subsidizing pension benefits for people in Central and Eastern Canada. And I think it's entirely reasonable for us to ask whether we could repatriate that those Alberta tax dollars here in Alberta, like Quebec has done, whether we could invest that to get high returns, at the same time helping to expand our kind of financial industry here in Alberta for economic diversification. In principle, let's say we were to have AIMCO, our Alberta Investment Management Corporation, invest roughly $40 billion of pension premiums alongside the $120 billion that it already invests on behalf of Alberta government pensioners and the savings fund. Then you'd have a much bigger fund, which could be more diversified in its investment profile, and also play in larger asset classes to get better returns. There's a lot of arguments to be made for it on the financial side, but the biggest argument would be that we would be able to reduce the CPP tax, the premiums, by up to $3 billion a year, which would, by reducing that payroll tax, help to create more jobs, more prosperity, more young people, more workers, more actuarial stability for the plan. And we could also potentially split the difference and reduce and improve payments to the seniors and retirees. So lower payroll taxes, more jobs, better benefits for retirees, stronger investment industry in Alberta, taking $3 billion a year back from Ottawa. There's a lot of good reasons to think about this, but we're doing a deep technical study and we've not made any final decisions. Ultimately, Albertans would decide in a referendum. All right, Sydney Arlene Fisher says, the pandemic showed some major holes in the system. Why didn't you add money to increase ICU beds in Alberta? Well, we did, Sydney. Last year, in the fiscal year that's about to end at the end of March, we added $2 billion to the healthcare system, which is about a 10% boost to what was already the most expensive healthcare system in Canada. So there's not a lack of money. Basically, we spared no expense to respond in the healthcare system. And part of that was, we did everything we possibly could to increase health capacity, including the number of ICU beds. But there's a caveat here. We could, it's obviously, the word bed is kind of a symbol or a metaphor. There's no shortage of actual beds, of course, and we actually built overflow capacity. Sprung Structures helped us next to the Peter Lougheed Hospital build a kind of temporary hospital setup with a couple hundred extra ICU equipped beds. The Butterdome here in Edmonton, similar kind of setup. So we expanded physical capacity and stuff. But ultimately, a real ICU bed is a work unit of healthcare workers. You can have a bed and you can have a ventilator and you can have the equipment, but you need the staff to operate it, obviously. And there's a scarce number of staff with relevant skills for this kind of pandemic. Respiratory therapists, anesthesiologists who can assist with intubation, ICU nurses, obviously. I understand that's about a 2-year extra training program from the regular RN training. So there is a finite number of people with those and other relevant skills. And that's the number we were running up against if we had allowed cases to run out of control with exponential growth in the fall and the winter. So I hope that answered your question. Sorry, now we go to Sydney Arlene Fisher. I already did that one. Alexander, we're jumping around here on the computer. Joanne Lemna says, will Alberta develop its own vaccine passport to allow for international travel? No, the government of Alberta will not be issuing that kind of documentation. And I've addressed why on that, Joanne. Bo Cheng Jing says, are people who get vaccinated in the United States traveling to Canada still need to be quarantined when they arrive? The answer is yes. It doesn't matter whether they've been traveling in the U.S. or anywhere else in the world. The same federal rules apply, and they are federal rules for self-isolation. Ron Damak says, why are you trying to sell Alberta registries? Doesn't it make money for Alberta? The answer is a couple of things, Ron. First of all, we're taking a look through an RFP process at whether we can sell that as an asset that would generate money for the province when we need it. We're in a fiscal hole. We could then potentially invest that money and get better returns. But also, I don't know why we think the government is necessarily the right or the optimal operator of a complex registry system. You know, we used to think in this province that only the government could sell alcohol. Thank God Ralph Klein came along with some common sense and said, to heck with it. The private sector does way better job of retailing than a government bureaucracy. Let's apply the same kind of thinking to a registry system. Registries involve, especially now, huge investments in information technology infrastructure, in computers and their renewal of the IT systems. And I got to tell you, I've been in government for a fair while, and I was the Minister of Employment and Social Development, big federal department, $100 billion plus budget. I have never seen a government IT project work out well And yet it's the private sector that has driven the digital revolution. And so why don't we recognize that the private sector is much better than governments at operating big, complex digital systems? Why would we if we want to keep the registries as a Crown asset, the administration of the registries, then we're taking on a huge risk that we'll have to spend hundreds of millions, who knows, billions of dollars to replace aging computer systems, etc. Why should the taxpayer own that risk when we could commercialize it? So this is a province that believes in free enterprise, that believes in competition, that believes in the market. Why do we think only bureaucracies can effectively run a complex system like that? So that's why we're putting it out for proposals. If we don't get any acceptable proposals, if the only bids we get are like what we think are way under market value, then we're not going to sell an asset at a steep discount. But I'll tell you what, let's imagine a price. Let's just. I probably shouldn't, because that might be seen as interfering in the RFP process. Let's just say we get $1 for it, okay? And we take that dollar and we put it in the Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund and have AIMCO invest it. They've been generating about 9.1% returns for the past decade. That is a much more efficient use of capital than us running the system with all of the downside risk and maybe some modest revenue stream coming off of it. So those are all the factors that we have to look at, and that's why we're keeping an open mind. All right, Kimberly DeLue says, what was the price of oil that the budget was based on? Thanks very much, Kimberly. The budget that Travis just tabled 10 days ago or 2 weeks ago, based on a projection of $46 West Texas Intermediate, which is the key benchmark. And right now we're at about $55 WTI. So that's a good problem to have. One thing we know, how volatile those oil prices can be, and it would be totally imprudent, even reckless for us, to rewrite our budget based on where the oil price is right now. I will tell you that, if the prices stay up around where they are, it'll help us for sure. It will help us on the royalty side and on the corporate tax side. But most importantly, it'll strengthen the balance sheets of those companies, and they'll come back with some increased capital spending, which means jobs. But I did want to point out, if you're kind of interested in this stuff, you can go to our budget. We put a link down below here. And it's not just the oil prices that matter. There's a whole page here of energy and economic assumptions, page 14 on the budget. So again, we're projecting here $46 WTI with a light heavy differential of $14.60. Right now it's 11. With WCS, Western Canada Select, of $41, and right now it's like $52. We projected natural gas at about $2.60 a gigajoule, and we're about $2.80 on the Canadian dollar right now on that. Conventional crude production, we projected at 410,000 barrels a day. We're actually exceeding that. Where we're really going high now is on bitumen production. And we projected a 1% interest rate, and the Bank of Canada governor earlier today confirmed that he's staying at, I think, 0.75. So I think our projections are pretty, they're erring on the side of being conservative, which is a good thing. Billy LeBlanc says, come on, a quick shout out to the Oilers. We're beating Ottawa 6-0. Sweet. And that is music to my ears. Beating Ottawa anytime is a good thing, and 6-0 is a trouncing. So good luck, Oilers, this season. Clement Morton says, and by the way, why did we schedule this against a hockey game? That was a stupid idea. We won't do that again. Clement Morton says, does the province have any plans to drill for geothermal and utilize the heat and energy for CO2 capture with air to fuel? Well, on the first part, yes, Clement, we We've published our minerals strategy, one of the sector strategies in the Alberta Recovery Plan, and a key part of it is a geothermal. To advance geothermal technology and its commercial application. We've got a couple of really exciting platforms going on in Alberta in that respect. And our Minister of Energy, Sonia Savage, is working on a regulatory and legal framework to facilitate geothermal. Like there's a lot of, if you want to do a geothermal project here, you want to know, well, what are the rules? Who do I apply to? Am I going to have to pay a royalty? What's the royalty structure? So we're creating a policy framework, not to get in the way, but to create some certainty and help with that. And on the second part, I think you're asking there about direct air capture of carbon. That is a very intriguing area of potential kind of green technology. Right now, we are focused more on the emerging carbon capture, utilization, and storage to build on the success of, for example, the Shell Quest facility that Alberta invested in. They've sequestered 10 million tons of CO2 already. And then we also just yesterday had a news conference celebrating the 1 million ton of CO2 sequestered and stored by enhanced energy with the Alberta Carbon Trunk Line that takes sequestered CO2 off of the Northwest Upgrader in Redwater and the Nutrien facility in Fort Saskatchewan, brings it down to around Clive, Alberta, injects it into the sedimentary basin. So those are we're working with the feds massively and the oil companies to expand projects like that to help us optimally to reduce output by about 30 megatons. But you know what? We're keeping an open mind through the Tier Fund and federal and industry partnerships to the next kind of, the next frontier, if you will, which is direct air capture, potentially holds huge, let me rephrase that. It's a technology that does hold huge potential, but it's not nearly as far down the path to commercial application and scalability as CCUS. All right, Ta Me says, is Alberta still considering severing ties with the RCMP, or is that just an Edmonton and Calgary thing? If so, how does that affect the other cities in the province? Thank you. Yet we are considering the possible creation of an Alberta Provincial Police Force. We had the Fair Deal panel in the winter of 2019-2020 consult Albertans on that and other issues. They came back and said, yes, you should create an Alberta Provincial Police Force. We've gone to the next step, which is a deep technical study being led by the Department of Justice and Solicitor General to look at the costs, benefits, and structure of a potential Alberta Provincial Police Force. Now, to be clear, we already have 7, I believe, municipal police forces in Alberta. Obviously, Edmonton and Calgary, Lethbridge, and Tabor is one. Camrose has one, and there's a few others. And so the question is, should we establish an Alberta Provincial Police Service to be available as the contract police force for kind of the rest of the province? So not the big cities. And the argument would be this, that the RCMP is a great police force, a lot of great, wonderful, I have a lot of friends in the RCMP. We all know great folks in that police force. We also know that it's a very big institution with a very diffuse and disparate mandate. It goes everything from highway patrol in rural Alberta all the way to complex like anti-terrorism stuff and cyber fraud and national security issues. I mean, it is a probably has by far the broadest mandate of any police service, major police service in the world. And there are a lot of critics saying that basic on-the-ground community policing kind of gets lost in the mix or gets underemphasized in that huge, complicated, multitasked police force. So that's one issue. Another issue is, as you may know, we've had a real problem with rural crime in the recent years, rural property crime especially, and a lot of rural Albertans understandably ticked off with very slow police response times. There's a lot of reasons for that, and I think things are getting a little bit better. We've been working with the police and with the RCMP, and they've been more responsive to municipalities, and Rural Crime Watch has been playing a useful role. So I think we're making some. Rural crime came down by about 8% last year, so I think there's been some improvement. But here's the deal. Typical RCMP officer being posted to a rural Alberta depot is coming from somewhere else in Canada. They land there. They're there for 3-4 years. It takes them a while to get to know the community, about the businesses, the local leaders, who are the repeat offenders, and all of that. And just by the time they've gotten to know all of that, they're often being shipped off to another province or another assignment, another depot. So you lack the kind of continuity that you get with community policing. In Calgary or Edmonton, as an example, most of the police in these cities, born and raised, spent almost all or most of their lives in those cities. They know the cities. They know the communities. They know the problem areas for crime. They know the social services agencies. They know the community leaders. They know, and that's the heart of community policing. And I just ask myself, why doesn't rural Alberta deserve the same kind of community policing? Wouldn't it be great if a young fella or gal who grew up in Rocky Mountain House, spent their lives there, were to go off to a police academy and come back and serve the rest of their lives or as long as they want in their career in that local town, where they know everybody on a first name basis, as opposed to some young guy from New Brunswick coming in and going out after 3 years. So sorry I took so long on that. I'm just explaining why I think the idea has a lot of merit. It's worth looking into for sure, and we'll report back to Albertans later this spring on that. I'm just going to take a couple more questions because I've been at this for too long, and it'd be nice to check out the hockey game. Randy McMullen, how are we going to get out of debt? That's a very good question, Randy. First of all, let's get out of deficit, because we can't even touch getting out of debt until we stop adding to the debt through annual deficits. So that's the short midterm goal or challenge. And I'll just say this, that look, before COVID, we were on path to get to a balanced budget and start paying down debt by 2023. And I think that's absolutely real, credible plan, 2.8% reduction in spending. We were going to get there. COVID just sideswiped us, and we've ended up now with a projected deficit in the upcoming fiscal year of $18 billion. If these strong energy prices persist, with a bit of good luck, who knows? Maybe it'll be more in the range of $15 billion. But that's still way too big. Now, where that plan takes us to is about an $8 billion deficit in 2023. Best case scenario that we cannot count on, with like $65 WTI and good gas prices, would get us down to in the range of $3 billion by 2023, but still a deficit. So when we get out into those out years, we as Albertans are going to have we get past the COVID crisis, get past this recession, get growth back in the economy, get people back to work, restore investor confidence. Those have to be the immediate obsessive goals, because economic growth is the best way to reduce the deficit, then eliminate the deficit, then hopefully start running some surpluses to pay down the debt. So growth has to be the center point of our policy. And that's what we're focused on right now. So let's hope that by 2023, we can get that deficit down to a few $1 billion, strong growth. Then we'll have to, in the meantime, we are continuing to drive for greater efficiency. We have been spending about 20% more per person than the average amongst the large provinces, which makes no sense, especially since nearly half the spending's on healthcare, and we have the youngest population. Today I was under attack by the NDP because we're asking our universities to operate a little more efficiently. Let me share some data with you. We have great world-class universities. We have to keep it that way. Great faculty, students, innovation, important part of the economy, world-class. Got to keep it that way. But, U of A gets about $18,000 per full-time student. U of C, it's about $16,500, I believe. But world-class universities and public universities elsewhere in Canada, McGill, Queen's, Western, U of T, they're getting like $6,500, $7,500 per student. We have the most expensive universities in the country. We have the most expensive healthcare system with the youngest population. We have the most expensive provincial government. And why? Because we could afford it in the past with $100 oil, $120 oil. Like, we could afford, politicians before me didn't have to say no. They didn't have to get called names. They didn't have to have protests and strikes and all of that. They didn't have to risk votes and political backlash because they could just buy political peace by writing checks on $100 oil. We can't anymore. It's over. We certainly can't count on that. And that's why we're trying to just gradually control the spending. If all you did was listen to the NDP and some of these special interest groups, you'd think, it's the end of the world. They call it austerity. Austerity. Ridiculous. We're talking about keeping the overall budget at $56 billion. The healthcare budget's we added $1 billion. But yeah, we're trying to find more efficient ways of doing it within that envelope. And that will require some shared sacrifice on the part of the folks that work in the government. They're good people. They do critical stuff. But you know what? They've got job security in the way the private sector never had. So that was another long answer. I apologize. But I just wanted to say, first things first, growth and carefully finding efficiencies so then we can go to Albertans and say, we are at least as efficient as other provinces, our economy's rolling again, and then we'll have to make decisions after that. I'm going to wrap it up. Wait, maybe one last one. John Timms, Premier, within this very busy legislative agenda, what are you personally looking forward to bringing forward the most? I would say for this spring session coming up, like just a personal thing that kind of turns my crank is the citizen initiative law that we'll be bringing in early next week. Because way back about 1993, 94, I spent a lot of time when I was the head of the Taxpayers Federation researching that. I ran a campaign to get Alberta to adopt a citizen initiative law. I actually wrote a draft law for citizens initiative. And I think a PC MLA introduced my draft law as a private member's bill way back 28 years ago. I'm dating myself here. So that is, it's all, for me, it's like the most powerful instrument of direct democracy, a good complement to our parliamentary system. And it says to Albertans, if the political people, the elected people like myself, are not responding to your priorities, you can go effectively around us. And teaser here, you get 10% of the voters to sign a legal petition. You can force a vote onto a referendum. I don't think we're in any danger of, by the way, I can already predict it, the usual suspects are going to come out and blast it, and it's dangerous, and they're going to talk about the California ballots and so forth. It's not as though we overdose on direct democracy here in Alberta. We've had fewer than 10 referendums in our 115-year history. So I think it's a good complement to our system. I'm really looking forward to that one. Anyway, folks, thanks for your patience. For those of you who stuck around, I enjoyed doing these things, getting a good cross-section of questions. Thank you for your patience through all of the pandemic. And like Tyler Shandro says, we now see not just the light at the end of the tunnel, we see the end of the tunnel. We're getting there. Let's land this and move on with our lives. Thank you. God bless.